Okay, we're going to make a start. This presentation is about recall, recovery and re-release, understanding the process and trauma of recall, and also supporting recovery from recall and re-release back into the community. My name's Jo Shingler. I'm a Principal Forensic Psychologist in the Dorset IIRMS service.
And I'm Jenny Stickney. I'm an Advanced Occupational Therapy Practitioner within the Dorset IIRMS service.
As I've said already, the session is being recorded. So by participating in the session, you're consenting to that, but please feel free to switch your cameras off. And if everybody could mute themselves, that would be great, so we don't get any feedback. We will be pausing for questions at a couple of spaces during the presentation. So if you please feel free to raise your hand, but also if you could put any questions or comments in the chat, then we will pause and address anything that's come up in the chat at our particular at the points at which we stop for questions. So yeah, do please feel free to put anything in the chat as we go along. I'm just going to have to admit a few more people. Excuse me. So that worked last time, didn't it? Okay. Okay. How do I? Okay. So we're going to be talking about recall, recovery and re-release, and so we will make a start. I'm just going to have to admit people at the same time, so excuse me. Oh, no. Okay. Okay, so in this workshop, we are planning to review the research around the prevalence and impact of recall. We're going to talk about how painful recall is and how it can undermine rehabilitation and resettlement efforts. And we're going to discuss some of the things that we do to support people post-recall and towards re-release. So we will be changing and swapping our presenting during that time. So hopefully that will make sense to people. I'm presuming everybody can hear us, and I'm presuming everybody can see the slides. This slide should say aims and focus. If there's any problems with any of that, could you just pop it in the chat, please? So we can address any difficulties straight away. Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to say briefly a little bit about what recall is and how it works. I'm sure most of you know this, but just so we're all on the same page before we start. Recall is a return to prison during a period of supervision by probation. So people are liable to be recalled if they breach the conditions of their licence, if their behaviour indicates an increased risk of serious harm, and if this risk cannot be managed in the community. People can be recalled either for 28 days or for a standard recall, which is indefinite in some cases, and decisions about re-release on a standard recall are taken by the parole board. And again, I know you probably all know this, but I just think it's really worth emphasising that for those people serving indeterminate sentences, including IPPs, they are liable to be recalled for the entirety of their period of supervision, pretty much forever. Like, I know that IPP sentence prisoners can apply to have their licence removed. There's not that many occasions in which that's successfully happened. I tweeted about that a few years ago because I wanted to know how many people had successfully applied for their IPP licence to be removed. And somebody responded on Twitter saying you're more likely to find somebody who's walked on the moon. Like, I'm not being sarcastic. So that's interesting. I would like to think, I don't actually know how many IPP licences have now been removed. I'd like to think it's more. I still don't think we're talking about very many people. So there is a chunk of people for whom the risk of recall is indefinite. And when we're thinking about the impact of recall, I sort of think it's really important that we hold that thing in mind, that people, a group of people that we work with, are vulnerable to recall forever. It is an important part of understanding the impact of recall, I think. Okay, I just want to say a bit about the background to recall. There's really good evidence that recall rates are increasing. We know the amount of people recalled in prison, the recall people in prison is going up. And for example, there was a 13% rise in IPP recalls between September 19 and September 2020. So there's good data in the HMPPS evidence team, better outcomes for recall prisoners, and also in the Prison Reform Trust summary, No Hope, No Freedom, No Future, both of which are easily accessible. And I think they're in the reference list at the end of this presentation. So we know that recall rates are going up. across the board, particularly amongst indeterminate IPPs, other indeterminate sentences. We also pretty much know that this increase in recall rate is not attributable to increased rates of offending on licence. So there's not suddenly a whole load of people reoffending whilst they're being supervised. There are other things that seem to be explaining this increased rate of recall. Firstly, is changes to criminal justice policy. So things like sentencing, the extended determinate sentence, for example, gave people longer periods on probation. Obviously, that longer you're on probation, the longer time you're at risk of recall. Things like extended periods of probation supervision, but also as you've only got to have a few high-profile failures in recall on supervision for policy to be tightened up and for recall to be come to the top in terms of a way of dealing with difficulties. So the sort of attitude, the political approach to criminal justice policy has an impact on the rate of recall. There's a framework for recalled prisoners, a probation sort of summary about how to address recall, and that's had an impact also on the rates of recall, how frequently people are being recalled, really focusing on sort of that public protection element, which absolutely is important, but sort of being perhaps increasing the likelihood or the willingness to step towards recall. I think the other reason we know that recall rates are not attributable to increased rates of reoffending are when we dig into the reasons for recall, it's pretty clear that the vast majority of people are recalled for things other than new offending. So 3/4 of all recalls are for something other than new charges or suspicion of a new offence, and that is absolutely consistent with our experience as practitioners. So the vast majority of people are recalled for non-compliance type things, missing appointments, failing to reside as directed, that sort of thing. So the experience of recall is very much about being recalled for something you might do rather than for something you have done. And I think that also taps into people's experience of what recall is like, what it feels like, and why it feels like that. Just to think for a moment about what the recall population is like, because this also informs our practice when we're trying to work with this group. They do tend to look slightly different to the broader prison population. They tend to be younger, recall people. They tend to have higher levels of risk and need. They tend to have high levels of unmet need, so perhaps being assessed as suitable for an accredited programme and not yet had the opportunity to complete that either in prison or in the community. And also recall people seem to have greater levels of responsivity needs, so things like learning disabilities, personality difficulties, and emotional vulnerability. So we are looking at a slightly higher risk, higher need, higher responsivity need group, which might contribute perhaps towards the willingness to recall them because it's felt that they are a more challenging, a more risky group. So that is just a little bit about some of the background to recall, and I will hand over to Jenny.
So how is recall experienced? We've asked some of the people that we work with how they have experienced recall, and we've had a couple of people talk about it as a really positive experience. Is what they really needed at the time. This is pretty unusual, but we wanted to just say that some individuals do experience recall in a really positive way. One man described saying that he was a mess, both physically and mentally, and knew that things were out of control, that he'd planned his end, and he knows that he wouldn't be here now if he'd not been recalled. We've also got another man who described feeling as though whilst he wasn't able to recognise at the time, on reflection of being back in prison, he was pleased to have been recalled and quite fearful of how his behaviour had been escalating and what would the repercussions of that been if he hadn't been recalled. So whilst these are unusual, these reflections are unusual, they are there that some individuals do see them, that recall as a positive experience to their longer term planning.
Maybe.
Could everyone just make sure that they're muted? Thank you. But the majority of individuals experience the real, really intense pain of recall, that it's an extreme pain. And we've had one man who said when recall happens, it happens very quickly, much quicker than when you were first arrested. It can be really traumatic, and it can feel really unfair, and it can leave people feeling shocked and fearful of what's just happened and what's going to happen to them. The fear of the unknown and disbelief about why, because it's unexpected a lot of the time, and the loss of what they had in the community during their resettlement experience and what they've lost in response to returning back to prison. And the emotional impact of recall is that it can feel, understandably, procedurally very unjust, that there is no court to recall people back to prison. There's no judge sentencing them back to prison. It can be based on a feeling or a suspicion of concern, and this can leave people feeling voiceless, as though they have no way of communicating their experience, what's gone on for them, and they've got no right to reply. It can feel very disproportionate to that individual's experience of what's going on for them, that individuals have described it as feeling as though they felt as though they were getting back on track, and suddenly they're recalled based on suspicion of concern about their behaviour. It can leave people feeling as though they have no value or no place in society. That they can just be plucked out of society and placed back in prison with no real thought about what's going on for them. And often individuals describe their experience of not having had the communication to describe what's going on, and sometimes the fear of being open about what's going on for them, because they're worried about recall, has resulted in them hiding that, and not then having a voice once they are in the recall process. And all of this gives a real sense of feeling hopeless and helpless about their situation, hopeless that they've ended back in prison, and helpless that they can't do anything about it. And many of the individuals that we've worked with who have been recalled back into prison have experienced the first few days of recall of just wanting to give up, that they're resigned to a life back in prison, and they see no hope that there could be a future release plan at all. So it's a very, very, very fragile time when people are first recalled back into prison. And the practical impact of recall, which is really, really felt by the individuals that we work with. The first one to mention is belongings, that when people are recalled back into prison, they leave behind absolutely everything. From that point of arrest to going back into prison, everything is left behind. They don't pack things necessarily. They're just taken as the person that they are in the clothes that they're in, which results in all their belongings being left behind. And just giving that some consideration of, one of the people that we work with, he hadn't no longer had contact with his children. But when he was recalled back to prison, the only photographs he had of his children as babies were left behind and subsequently disposed of, because nobody felt that was something that was really important, or no way of getting it to him. We've got another individual who was recalled on the streets and left all his belongings in his room, and they were really valuable. He'd saved, he'd been really sensible with his money, he'd managed to save his money, and he'd bought things that were important to him, and they were left behind, and they weren't, there's no access to them. He doesn't know what's happened to them. And another individual that we work with, who he's deaf, he has no hearing, and he went to bed at night, was recalled in the middle of the night, and on the recall asked if he could pick up some belongings and wasn't able to. And one of the things that he wanted to pick up was his hearing aid. So he was returned back to prison with no ability to hear, no ability to understand what was going on for him. And it was a really, really difficult time. So belongings are absolutely crucial to consider when somebody's been recalled, and the importance of them and what they're leaving behind. And as a service, we are very, very attuned to that. And whilst we don't have large storage facilities to store things, we are in a position where we can have discussions with people about what's really important to them to hold, and generally they are paperwork and photographs that are really crucial, that just cannot be replaced.
Can I just add something?
Yeah.
I think one of the things, and it would never have occurred to me to think about somebody's belongings when I was working in prisons, when somebody was recalled, it just wouldn't have been on my radar. That's a thing I've learned through working alongside occupational therapists, how important those things are. And actually, the more I think about it, the more I think, when I think about myself, how much our own identity is defined by the things we own and the things that are around us. And we've got people in our service who have just started to get a bit of a foothold in their life in the community when something goes wrong and they're recalled. So then what they lose is not just their freedom, but that sense of who they are as somebody in the community, which is partly defined by the things that they own, the things that they have accrued. So I think that the loss of belongings, whilst it might seem like a very small thing in the great context of a recall, actually is about somebody's identity. And I think it is important that we sort of acknowledge that.
Yeah, really. Absolutely. Really, really important. Another area is appointments. And what we have found is that where individuals, as they resettle back into the community, a lot of the health issues that haven't been able to be addressed whilst they were in prison are being addressed in the community. So hospital appointments have been made, and it's taken a long time to get to, and the recall process means that those appointments can't be made, that they start again trying to sort out health and dentistry appointments, which can feel enormously upsetting and can impact on their health. As we know, there's huge health inequalities with this population anyway, so those sort of things really matter. So that continuation of sorting out the healthcare. Relationships. And relationships in every single sense. So that's professional relationships, that's personal relationships, that's friendships and intimate relationships. All of those things are really affected by recall. People are taken out of the society and taken back to prison with very little contact with people that are close to them. And we have one individual who describes losing everything on his recall, that his friends, he didn't feel able to communicate with his friends because he felt so embarrassed that he'd been recalled, and they didn't know where he was for quite a long period of time, so they couldn't maintain contact. So it really fractures relationships, and intimate relationships can feel very, very distressing, that you don't know where somebody is or where they're going or how to get in contact with them. And it also impacts on professional relationships, that people can feel very aggrieved that we're part of an organisation that has resulted in them being returned back to prison, and that voicelessness that they feel within that. And other commitments. I mean, we support people in their resettlement experience in getting structure and routine to their lives. So looking at voluntary work, paid employment, educational opportunities, engaging with lots of groups within the community. But that recall experience means that they're letting those commitments down, and there's no way of communicating the organisations that they feel very much part of, and saying that I won't be coming in, I'm not able to make it, and that guilt and frustration that those individuals feel at that time.
Okay, we're going to stop again. I just also wanted to say, before I move on to talk a bit about how recall can undermine desistance, I wanted to say a little bit about why we're talking about recall at all. And I probably should have said this earlier on, but I was distracted by people trying to get into the waiting room. I think one of the reasons we're talking about recall is because as a community service, it's become very clear how emotionally painful recall is, how challenging it is. And I think when I was working in prisons, and I was doing lots of assessment in prisons, and when I would be assessing somebody who was recalled, I just really wouldn't give it a second thought. I would look at the reasons for recall and sort of think to myself, well, there must have been more to it than that. People don't get and people don't get recalled, don't get me wrong. Somebody else is trying to come in. But I think that I didn't give enough recognition or enough consideration to the impact of recall, how it feels, what the experience is, and how that affects people's ability to sort of pick up and reset and continue their desistance journey. I think it's become apparent to me how painful and damaging recall is in all sorts of ways I've just talked about. since working in a community service and witnessing people being pulled out of the community back into prison. I also think it's important to acknowledge that, you know, we work with a group of really, really good probation officers who try their absolute damnedest to keep people in the community. And we absolutely accept that there are times where that can't happen and where people need to be recalled. I guess our experience is also that people generally are recalled for not for non-compliance or for deterioration things around resettlement rather than reoffending. And I think it is important to bear that in mind when we're thinking about the services we offer people and how we work with people, both their first release and sort of subsequently. Did you want to add anything, Tony?
No, I think that's right.
Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about how recall undermines desistance and rehabilitation efforts. There's some stuff in some references at the end of the presentation that you can sort of attend to this a bit more if you're interested in. So recall can be re-traumatizing. The act of being, well, sometimes, you know, in the middle of the night, Jenny was talking about an example, in the middle of the night, police bursting into your room or being grabbed off the street, that sense of just being plucked out of somewhere with no warning, because people generally don't know they're going to be recalled, for understandable reasons. But that experience of being plucked out of society, leaving behind everything you own and being moved physically into a different space. So you're moved out of perhaps a safe space in a hostel or in your own accommodation where you've got your things around you, you're plucked out of that, and then you're in a custody suite in a police station. So actually that experience, again, the people we work with who screen into the OPD pathway are already probably traumatized. So that actual physical experience of recall, before we even think about the emotional experience, can be really triggering and re-traumatizing, literally being plucked out of society and removed from all of your sort of safe things and your things that, you know, give you a sense of belonging and identity, and put back into some sort of criminal justice, police sort of custody area. And emotionally, I guess, you know, the triggers around being arrested, what that can trigger in terms of memories of offending or memories of sort of past traumas. It can be a really traumatic experience in itself. But before we even get on to the reasons for recall or what might have been going on in somebody's life, the actual physical experience of recall can be re-traumatizing. People feel very much pushed back into their old identities, like the progress they've made is sort of disregarded, that they're just plucked out of society. There's no place for you here, and pulled back into prison. There's a sense, and we'll come on to say a bit more about this, that any progress that's been made is disregarded. And this is partly a systemic thing. So obviously, if somebody's recalled, there has to be a justification. The Part A or the Part B, whatever it's called, I can't remember, that has to be written to explain the reasons for somebody's recall. Now, quite understandably, that report often weighs heavily on the things that went wrong in order to explain the reasons for recall. But what people experience when they read that is like, but what about all the stuff I did? What about the good stuff? And we had somebody who was recalled after 3 years in the community, and he's done amazingly well in all sorts of different ways. Had found his own accommodation, had found sort of independent accommodation, had been working, had a number of, you know, sort of jobs in which he engaged with his co-workers. There was a collection of things, and I think his recall was sort of inevitable, and he thinks that too. But actually, he had done remarkably well. And when I was engaging with the prison psychologist post-recall to talk about risk, their focus was very much on, well, what treatment does he need to do to reduce the likelihood of him being recalled? I'm like, well, actually, let's have a think about all the things he did really, really well before we think about what went wrong. That needs to be acknowledged and understood, and the recall needs to be seen in its context. So there is often a sense from people who are recalled that all of the things they did to begin to build a positive sort of offence-free life in the community, those things are sort of systemically disregarded by the processes that act on them in order to get to recall them. And consequently, when people are pulled back into prison, there's that sort of sense of being helpless and despairing about change, like I did all of these things and it still wasn't enough. I still couldn't do it. There's nothing I can do now. You're feeling very alone, feeling very like there's no voice, like we said already, like there's nothing they can do to change it. So coming back to the voice thing, Jenny's already touched on this, but it's just so important to bear that in mind, that recall is one of the few criminal justice interventions where there is no immediate right to reply. So like a breach, for example, or a charge, or a conviction, you have the opportunity to put your side of things, or with your, with your legal representative, put your side of things to a court. But when you're recalled, you are literally pulled out of society, back into prison, and there is an opportunity absolutely at the parole board, if you're an indeterminate sentence prisoner, to explain your reasoning and explain your perspective, but that is often many months down the road. So there is actually there's a feeling of lacking voice and not having a say, but actually that is also legitimate. That's how the criminal justice system works around recall, and that needs some thought, I think. People often feel that the reasons for their recall are uncertain, and Nikki Padfield talked about there being many painful uncertainties around recall. And the difficulty is when people don't feel clear about their recall, they tend to attribute it to sort of hostile or suspicious motives, like, well, they recall me to get their caseload down, or they recall me because they needed my bed in the hostel, or they recall me because of my race. So when things are uncertain, people understandably fill it in with sort of hostile and suspicious motives. And interestingly, in one of the sort of evidence reviews of recall, there was interviews with recalled people, but there was also interviews with offender managers. And offender managers talked about feeling very clear about the reasons for recall and feeling they'd communicated those things clearly. But actually, the recall people generally felt unclear about their reasons for recall. So there was a bit of a mismatch there in terms of how we communicate the reasons for recall and how we support people through those painful uncertainties. Again, Jenny's already touched on this, but just to talk a bit more, and if anyone is interested in Flora Fitzallen's Howard paper about this, it really sort of brings these things to the fore. We know that recall undermines relationships with criminal justice professionals, particularly community probation officers. It can create a lack of motivation to engage with probation. Touched already on the anger, frustration, the suspicion, the grievance, like they did this deliberately, they did this to hurt me, they did this because they don't like me, they did this because they didn't support my release in the first place, and they felt aggrieved. I've had somebody have that's their narrative around their recall. They didn't agree with my release, therefore they did everything they could to get me recalled. Now, I don't think that's true, but that's the view that the person held. People can feel very let down by the probation, by services. They feel like they can't trust services, and they lose faith in them, particularly when, again, reasons feel unclear to the person who's being recalled, and we all feel part of the same system that has treated them badly. That can be a narrative around recall. And consequently, there's the risk of reduced likelihood of openness and sort of meaningful engagement in the future. And Flora talks about this in her research. She talked about two different ways in which people would disengage from services. There was the active defiance group who were like, I am not engaged with probation. I'm not having anything to do with probation. I will stay in prison to the end of my licence, or I will refuse to engage in the parole process in order to avoid the probation service having any more control over my life. So there's like this actively defiant, two fingers to probation sort of attitude post recall. But there's also the sort of feigned compliance. Yeah, well, I'll turn up and I'll tick the boxes and I'll come to my appointments and I'll do what you say, but I won't meaningfully engage with you. I won't talk to you. I won't share anything with you. And when you think about our ability to manage somebody's risk in the community, that's really problematic. We need people to be engaging meaningfully with us if we've got any chance of supporting them to build a life that is free from offending. So there is one of the challenges, I think, with recall is whilst recall might have been initiated in order to manage risk, actually, I think it makes our job of managing risk in the community even harder post-recall. So there are some really tricky issues there that we need to be thinking about as community practitioners. Did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's great.
We were just going to have a little pause for questions. I don't think there's got any. Does anybody want to ask anything? Either feel free to raise your hands or type a question into the chat if you'd like to, or any observations, anything. We can literally see nobody, see our own screen, so we've actually no idea if there's anybody listening or not.
I don't think there's any questions coming through. Nobody with it up. Hands up.
Okay.
Thank you, Mary. Okay.
Okay. If there's no questions, we will carry on. It's me actually.
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay. If anything comes to you while we're carrying talking, please pop it in the chat, and we will have another break for questions at the end of this section. Okay, so we just want to go on to talk a little bit about working with people post recall, and we are coming from a community perspective, but we've both also got prison experience, so we are also thinking about how we can think about supporting people in prison when they've been recalled. So we want to think about how we support people, how we re-engage people, and think a little bit about working towards re-release. So one of the things that we have come to learn is that connection is one of the most important things we can do post recall. And one of the chaps we work with, who was recalled, actually has since been re-released, said, I found the consistent support offered to me by community services every 4 to 6 weeks, the writing, the video calls and visits, the most helpful. This felt like a contact support. It helped me understand the process of recall. The continuity of support helped me feel connected to the community. So there is something about that connection with people post recall that supports them, but also helps to keep the thread of community alive. Like, there is still a place for you here. We're still holding you in our minds, and we're still sort of holding the idea of you being in the community, and maintaining contact with the community services felt really, really helpful for him. And this was both immediately after recall, but also consistently across the period that the person was in prison post recall, and then supporting him towards a re-release. So one of the things we know, and I want to say it right in a minute, is connection post recall is the single most important thing we can do. People often feel very forgotten about after recall. They feel just invisible. They feel like that they've lost everything. And Jenny talked about some of the practical and emotional losses around recall, but connection is the single most important thing we can do. I also wanted to just talk a bit about the immediacy of connection, and this is another quote from somebody who wrote to us actually in response to a letter from us very, very shortly after his recall. And he said, 3 to 4 days into a recall, I was sat on my bed, my head in bits. I received a letter. That letter was from the team working with me. The failure was mine, but far from dropping me and moving on. They told me how sorry they were at my recall, but it reassured me how they were every bit as much still behind me and would be if I wanted to try again. I can't tell you how much that meant or how much I needed it at that moment. And again, I think this experience, this was a few years ago, of supporting this person through recall is really what's made me think hard about how important our role is when somebody's recalled. I think because caseloads are so high, understandably, when somebody's recalled, often community offender managers have got so many people in crisis in the community that somebody in prison does go to the bottom of the pile. I absolutely understand that. I think that the tiniest indications of connection and being held in mind can have the most transformational effects. And I realise that's a big word. All we did for this person was write him a letter. That is all we did. You know, it took me 20 minutes to put some words together saying, you know, I'm really sorry to hear you've been recalled. I mean, it was a very small thing, but clearly had this quite significant impact on somebody who felt remembered, felt like there was people still there, people who hadn't given up on him. And I guess this experience really made me think about what are we doing when somebody's recalled? How do we help them? And it sort of changed my practice around working with people when they're recalled. So there is something about that reaching out to somebody recalled. It doesn't need to be massive. It doesn't need to be time consuming or that onerous. It's just a letter or just an email. It's not even a letter now, it's an email. We use email a prisoner prolifically, don't we? So actually that's quite a quick thing to do. And I think the impact of that can be really significant to people who are literally feeling like they have lost everything they have.
And I think it also increases their visibility. I think individuals have described feeling on recall completely invisible, that they don't know the details of why they've been recalled. They haven't had the conversations, feeling as though they're nobody, just a number being put back in prison. And these connections that we've formed with individuals very soon after recall makes them feel visible, feel remembered, feel connected with people that make them feel as though they matter.
I think we sort of touched on already that recall is so disruptive to sort of people's emotional well-being and also to their connection with services, that we have to work even harder to get these people back on side. And I think we do sometimes need to do more, because we're not starting a new relationship, we are repairing a ruptured relationship. We'll sort of say a bit more about that, I think, shortly. I just wanted, because this is a bit of a thing for me, for us, I wanted to say a little bit in this context about letter writing, just because I think I've become very interested in it after these experiences with people who are recalled. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about how important letter writing can be, or email writing. It doesn't have to be an actual physical letter. Email writing is fine. And what I think is really good about letter writing is that it's like this sort of, it's an extension of your relationship with somebody. You write, when you write as yourself, don't you? So you're sort of connecting with somebody, and they can feel your personality and your relationship in your writing, because we write as we start. I try to write as I speak when I'm writing to people in this context. So it can really feel like an extra contact, an extra support, and a person-to-person support, person-to-person contact. It's not anonymous. I don't use any pro formas. I construct every letter dependent on my relationship with that person. And that, in that way, it feels familiar. It feels like, you know, you're reminding somebody of a relationship they had. Jenny's already mentioned how important it is for people to feel visible, that they're not forgotten. And receiving an email or a letter is an indication that somebody has at some point remembered them, because they've remembered them enough to hold them in mind, put pen to paper, or to email them and to send off an email. So it's very tangible indication that somebody is remembered. The other thing I really like about letter writing, particularly around something as emotionally traumatic as recall, is that you can use a letter to do things actually that you can't very easily do when you're in the community and somebody's in prison, because actually it's still quite difficult to get to people. Video links can take a while to set up. It can be hard for people to phone if they haven't got any money. Often people are recalled and taken to prisons quite a long way away, so practically it can be difficult to visit them, although we do try very hard to do that. So actually a letter, you can offer somebody an opportunity to reflect on, when you feel ready, perhaps we should have a think about what went wrong there, or perhaps we should have a think about the things that led up to that recall and see what we can learn from them. So your letter can provide that opportunity to reflect. I mean, you can offer somebody that opportunity in their own time to do that. You can give information. So you can, for example, explain alongside somebody's probation officer. You could explain the reasons for recall in a letter, and then it's written and it's clear, and people can go back over it and reread it. So anything perhaps you worried something might be misunderstood in a phone call, you're perhaps worried that somebody hasn't taken on a message, you can write it in a letter and they can reread it and clarify the reasons. Yeah. Do you want to add? You sounded like you did.
Yeah, no, we've just got a lot of experience from, especially people with neurodiverse difficulties or learning difficulties, finding retaining information really difficult, and letter writing really provides one individual keeps a pack of the letters that we've written to him, so they keep referring back to information that we shared with him.
The other thing I like about letters is that they can, people, you can lay out what you intend to do as a professional, and then people can hold you to account. They can feel a bit more confident that you're going to do what you say you're going to do, because they've got it in writing. So people often ask us to write, if I'm re-released, what all my support services look like, and we will write in a letter, this is what we might do, this sounds like it might be. And actually then people have taken those letters to the parole board, they've shared them with their solicitor, and quite rightly they can then hold us to account for those things. We can change release plans, but they've got like an agreement with us in writing that can feel quite reassuring. And you can use letters to repair ruptures. You can use them to apologise if you need to express your desire to repair a ruptured relationship. So I realise this has disrupted our relationship, and I want to think about how we might get over that and how we might work together. It gives you an opportunity to listen to somebody, to listen to their perspective if they write back, and share your own perspective, but also to express your motivation to repair a rupture in a relationship, which is really important to do. You can provide hope in a letter, you can be encouraging, you can praise somebody, you can remind them of all their successes. You can expressly say, please don't give up. I know you can do this. I know you've got this. These things went wrong. We can work on those things and we can try again. So you can explicitly engage in hopeful communication in a letter. And sometimes those things are quite difficult in a phone call. You might forget all the things you want to say, or you might get pulled off on a tangent about something. But a letter gives you as a professional time to think about what you want to say and how you want to say it and what your priorities are. As I said already, it's a reminder that the person is held in mind, that you've remembered them sufficiently to write them a letter. And you can also validate the pain of recall. You can say, this must be awful. I'm really sorry you're in this position. Whatever they've done, that doesn't remove the emotional pain of recall. So you can acknowledge that. And actually that goes a long way sometimes, just to repairing ruptures in relationships or helping people feel connected. It is an individual thing though, and we don't write to everybody, because for some people that is not a medium through which they can easily communicate. So it is something that is absolutely, it exists in the relationship you have with a particular person you're working with. So it's worth thinking about whether that's something that would work for them. Thank you. I'll move on now.
Another area that we offer supports post-recall is our professional intervention. We ensure that the person understands their recall. So particularly with people with neurodiverse difficulties, we work alongside probation to support how best to communicate with them whilst they're in prison, because some people really struggle to hold in mind why they've been recalled, and revisiting the recall experience and talking through it regularly and being consistent with that information is really, really important. So we work really closely with probation officers to make sure that our support is in line with what they're talking about, so everybody's coming from the same song sheet. We look at repair and rupture of relationships, and I think that this has been a really, really significant thing that we've had to work on, because for recall, and when people are in prison post-recall, relationships are really, really tricky, and often the recall experience and the post-recall experience can cause enormous ruptures to professional relationships as well as other relationships. An individual that I've been working with for a number of years, there was a significant rupture within our relationship as he returned back to prison, and it took a long time to repair that. It took almost the best part of a year to repair it, but that was done very slowly and gradually through letter writing, through attempted video calls, through visiting him, and numerous other ways of making sure that he knew that he was held in mind. And gradually that relationship built and repaired and is stronger as a result of that rupture, but was the first time that he ever realised that relationships could be repaired. He'd never experienced having ruptured a relationship and repaired it, and that was a real turning point for him, repairing other relationships and being able to work alongside other people. And a future progression for him was that rupture repair that we took a very long time to achieve. So it's really, really important.
I wonder if I should just add to that. We've had a really similar situation in which somebody was recalled and blamed their community offender manager entirely. And actually, in a really unfair, it was very unfair from my perspective, because I saw both sides and I saw information that the community offender manager couldn't share with the person. And I knew how hard she tried to keep him out of prison. He couldn't know that for various reasons. And we went through a long process of engaging in video links and phone calls and visits to try and support that ruptured relationship, giving both the man and the probation officer the opportunity to explain their perspective and explain the impact on them. And actually, it was unsuccessful. We didn't repair that relationship. The man sort of said he would try and work with his probation officer again, but he couldn't really do it. He couldn't get over, this is somebody who screens into the OPD pathway. He's got lots of challenges in relationships, but he couldn't overcome that. He came back out again, was recalled again very quickly, but actually for committing another offence, pretty unusual. But interestingly, blamed his community probation officer for his failure of his second release. Well, if I hadn't been so wound up about that, I would have done better. So, you know, you can try. And it's really important. I'm still glad we tried. I still think those things were the absolute right things to do. The connection, the video links, the facilitating people to express their perspectives. But sometimes it's not going to work. But I think the willingness and the motivation and, you know, absolute admiration for his community probation officer, who sort of sat there while he said, you did this, you did this, you did this, and took that and, you know, said, okay, you know, these are the reasons for that, and these are, and this is where I want to go, this is how I want us to work together. But sometimes those things don't work. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try, because we still communicated with him a willingness to work together despite those difficulties. And I do think that's really important.
Yeah, thanks. Being aware of the emotional burden of recall, especially for colleagues in prison. So in 2011, 14% of all prisoners who took their own lives were called prisoners, and yet recalls usually are not treated as new arrivals. But this is a huge thing, returning to custody, that people who have been in prison before sometimes are seen as familiar individuals and don't necessarily go through the same entry into prison and induction into prison as new people who are new. And it's one of the most high risk times for individuals, as this indicates high suicide rates, high reduced mental health, deterioration in mental health, the reduction in relationships and ability to access meaningful relationships puts these individuals at a very, very high risk to themselves. And I think being aware of that emotional burden by prison colleagues is absolutely essential.
And I think, just going back to what I was saying a moment ago, is that I don't think I would have thought about any of these things before I was working in the community. I think when I did tend to take that view when I was working in prisons, that, you know, just sort of seeing, you know, the recall and re-release and somebody's recall, you just put it as part of the picture. You don't really, I'll own it, I didn't particularly personally give enough weight to the impact of that and how that would affect somebody's ability to, you know, re-engage and plan for another release.
Yeah. So the next thing that we look at is communication. We, as soon as we know somebody's been recalled, when we find out what prison that they've gone to, we contact the prison where there's appropriate and important information to share. That's often related to making sure that the person can safely settle on entering prison, and can include when we know somebody's of a particular risk themselves, when we know that they've got skill deficits will impact on their ability to safely arrive in prison and settle into prison. What I mean by that is individuals who have difficulty in processing information, people who understand information when it's given to them in particular ways, and we know that. So it's about sharing that information to support the prison in being able to support them to safely settle. And sharing our contact details for future communication. There's been a lot of times where we've contacted prisons early on in somebody's arrival, and it's all very new, and they've taken on our contact details, and then a couple of weeks later we've been contacted to say, can you share a bit more information about these individuals, because we're just getting to know them. So that's really, really important. We also contact specific agencies within prison. So we contact Safer Custody. Some individuals on arriving in prison have emailed us, written to us, or called us to say that they don't feel safe, and we've had to react to that and contact Safer Custody just to make sure that the prison is aware of that. We've contacted mental health services, especially when people we are aware of on sort of medication for mental health difficulties, or are a significant risk themselves at the time, or that the information that they've got they'd find useful in supporting their mental health needs whilst in prison. For some individuals, specifically those with, as I mentioned before, hospital appointments that have had to be cancelled as a result of their recall, we've contacted healthcare in prison to make sure that they're aware of that, and to see whether they can start to instigate referrals within that local prison or the settlement prison, training prison. And we contacted OMU just to say that we are involved with this individual for future planning, to make sure that there's consistency and sharing of information with all agencies and professionals involved. So that the final one in preparing for release that we've got points are holding hope and ensuring mattering, which we think are absolutely key to making sure people settle back into prison safely, but follow their pathway back out into the community. So recall is an extremely traumatic experience, and people often need to feel heard about their recall experience, and we listen to that experience. Sometimes we don't necessarily agree with all their recollections and all their explanations about what's going on, but it's really important that for that individual to be heard and for their experiences of how they feel about it to be validated. So we do spend quite a lot of time with individuals hearing their recall experiences, and that's not just immediately on recall. That tends to follow them throughout their custodial journey back out into the community, where they repeat their experiences, and so it's quite acute in the first few weeks of their recall. It settles down, and then as they head on out towards release and resettling, it becomes a narrative again, and that's often fear-based about what will this release look like, and will I face the same difficulties as I did last time. We reflect on the positive achievements in the community, and as Jo mentioned, we do this through writing, through letter writing, and through speaking with them. But one of the things that we have done with some individuals, again, not everybody, it's very individualised, is for those individuals that have had really positive experiences in the community, but the recall experience has really become so traumatic that they've not been able to reflect on those positive experiences. We've encouraged them to write to us letters about what their positive memories are of living in the community, and that forms a really good basis to form preparing for release, because we're able to recall to them about what they did well in the last time that they were in the community.
Can I just add? So and that we obviously ask people to remember that themselves, but again, I think an interesting thing we do as practitioners is write ourselves to say, these are the things that we think you got right, and these are things that we think you did really well. And putting that, we've been asked to do that. Somebody asked us to do that. They could submit it for their parole, but actually, I think it's a really good thing to do anyway, isn't it? And you know, and it gives you an opportunity actually to reflect yourself, because I think sometimes for us, when we've been working with somebody closely and they're recalled, you can feel very hopeless yourself and feel like, well, you know, that was all pointless, or, you know, what on earth do we think we're doing? And actually sometimes for us professionally, sort of sitting down and going, no, hang on, what went well, what worked? Actually, that's really valuable for us, for our reflections as well. So that process can be quite quite healing.
And reflect on skills and strengths to develop plans for meaningful roles. And that's not just roles that they've had in the community, it's how they can form sort of a life for themselves in prison that's going to be meaningful for future release. So what roles can they do that keep the skills that they learned, the strengths that they developed in that time in the community that it had, however short that might be? What skills can they keep alive and keep using through the roles in the prisons that they might be able to access, that will be purposeful and meaningful to that individual as they progress towards resettlement again? And support and making the person feel visible is a really important role, especially for individuals that don't have any contact with the community. They don't have friends or family that will keep in contact with them. Our roles alongside probation and often the APs that they might have stayed at is really important to make that person feel as though they're remembered, they matter, that we hold them in mind, and that their return back to the community really matters. We look at revisiting release plans in light of recall. So what worked well and what didn't, what wasn't something that worked or that was meaningful to the individual. What do we need to change for the next time?
Can I add to that? Sorry. I'm just sort of thinking back to what you were saying a moment ago. We were talking about writing to people about their strengths and their successes and how that's useful for us. I think another thing we try to do after every recall is hold a professional debrief, which we often initiate. but we'll invite the community offender manager, any other services involved, and sometimes involve the prison offender manager if that's appropriate, so they can learn, or, they can sort of understand what went on. And we might invite the hostel staff, just so we can talk through what went wrong, and what everybody feels about it, because actually it can be really distressing professionally. When when things were looking good and then they weren't, or like a release plan that looked really solid actually disintegrates very quickly. We all need to learn from that as professionals, don't we? So actually having that time where we all think about, okay, what was our role, and what do we think went wrong, or how do we feel about that recall, given the investment we made professionally as a sort of team, especially when people have served long custodial sentences and there's been a lot of build up towards a release. You can feel really fed up and hopeless and sort of stressed about a recall, and actually that space professionally for us to have a think about what went on, and just to offload our own emotional experience can be really useful.
And support each other. So keeping things simple, like looking back at right back to the basics about what can be done to best prepare people in prison for successful resettlement. So really focusing on how the person can structure their time on recall in prison, what can they access that's going to have some structure and give them routine, making sure that they eat regularly, that they get up at a certain time, that they don't have disrupted night's sleep, all the things that are really important for when they access the community again. I think one individual reflected that on his recall, he found socialising with other people really, really difficult, and therefore tended to isolate himself in his cell. But that did mean that when he was released back out in the community, having a lot of people around him and lots of sort of access to lots of people was really enormously stressful, overwhelmed him, and he tended to isolate there. So keeping sort of a normalised day routine and night routine as much as possible within prison is really important. Keeping the future in mind early on. I think we mentioned earlier that people on recall have that hopelessness and helplessness that life is just going to be back in prison and there's no plan for the future. So keep future planning as early on as possible, that we're in this together and we will support you, you're not alone, and we'll make plans that work and we will get there. And don't give up. I think that's one of the things that we've had to be really, really mindful of, that things don't always go as planned, that working together as a team to support each other, to support the individual at times of a real difficulty is really, really important. And for that person in prison on recall to know that we're there and we won't give up on them has been absolutely instrumental in the relationships we've formed them and got them back out into the community to enable us to work successfully with them as they move forward in their resettlement experience. That's, unless you've got anything
No,
else to
I
say,
don't think so. No.
I think that's the end of our presentation. Are there any questions that people would like to ask, or any reflections that people would just like to share?
And we've got a question in the chat, so I'll just read that out. But actually, if anyone wants to put anything else in the chat or raise your hand, I don't know if we'll be able to see raised hands. So try that, and if it doesn't work, then unmute yourself and just speak. So there's a question from Julia. Is any information given to prisoners when they are recalled to explain what will happen? So actually, I don't know that. That's a good question. Whether or not if any prison colleagues can answer that. What I do know is that people often don't know what's going to happen. So even if they're given information, I don't know how clear that information is, how accessible it feels, or how emotionally able people are to take that information in. So I think there is something about how people are communicated with. Often the first contact people get is their Part A recall report, which can, again, as we've touched on, feel quite negative because it is the place in which the recall is justified. That can be the first contact sometimes people have. And my sense is, or my experience is, that people don't feel clear, and actually that's sort of consistent with the research about recall. People don't feel clear about why they're recalled or what happens next, what they've got to do to get out again, and what the process is. So I don't know what information people are given, but I do know often people don't feel very clear about it. So even if the information is given, it's probably some thinking to be done around that.
Yeah, I think the general message we get as people are recalled is that they don't know really. They know some of the behaviour that they've shown, but they don't know the actual why. What was it?
Tipped it over the edge.
Yeah, that led to the actual recall.
Yeah. And that's the only question in the chat. Somebody felt, again, Julie felt that a letter would be really useful for those with LDC. Is that learning LDC?
Learning, I don't know.
I don't know what that means. Okay, but I agree. Letters are really useful. Oh, there's a hand up. Do you want to unmute yourself? And Lucy, do you want to unmute yourself and say hello? And ask
Hi, thank you.
Hi.
Thank you for a really interesting presentation as well. There was loads of really valuable stuff in there. I just wanted to ask, I saw in the start of the presentation that you're from the Dorset area. How wide is this approach to recall and kind of the steps that you take? Is this a regional or is it national?
No,
you go ahead. Yeah.
So we're part of the Offender Personality Disorder Pathway, which is a national pathway. There's an OPD pathway within every county of the country now, so it is a national project. Some are more established than others. We're quite an established service. Others are a little bit newer.
I would say though that I think we have thought quite a lot about recall, haven't we? Because and I don't know what approach different services have different models and do things in a different way. And I think we have thought a lot about recall because we've had some very painful recalls, haven't we? And it's made us just really think about what we need to do to support people. And then again, looking sort of digging out into the wider research and realizing that this is a big problem. Actually, recall rates are rising, and actually recall causes such an immense amount of distress and is so damaging to relationships and so damaging to the, to what you need to do to support someone to be re-released. We started thinking about, actually, there's something needs to be different here. So, we need to be doing something differently, or we need to be trying to avoid recall at all costs. I absolutely accept that recall is sometimes necessary, but we need to be thinking about how we support people to avoid recall, but also how we support them post-recall. So it's not really for us to say about what other IIRMS do. I don't know, but I know that we are quite interested in it generally.
Probably a bit more than some others, yeah.
Does that answer your question? Sorry.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. I also had a second question, if that's all right.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I don't want to take up all the time. When you were talking about information sharing, one of the things that I'm from the National Prison Safety Team, and one of the things we look at is, safety outcomes in terms of self-harm and self-inflicted deaths, which is obviously a key factor within this group as well, or it can be. That information sharing, you said that you contact the prison quite early on. Who do you contact within the prison? Would it be a POM? Would it go to reception? And kind of how early does that process start to go underway?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, actually. So we contact the prisoner as soon as we know which prison they're at, which can take a few days for us to be aware of that, because we're reliant on the NDLIS. So that takes a little bit of time to get to know. And it really does depend on each individual as to who we'll contact. So we've contacted Safer Custody very quickly. We've contacted healthcare, mental health services, and sometimes when we don't know who the POM is because it's too early, we've just contacted the OMU directly.
I think a general first port of call is the POM, unless there's a specific concern about somebody.
Yeah.
Would you say that?
Yeah, sort of the OMU when one hasn't been identified yet.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
We've got a question from Elena. Do you want to unmute yourself and say hi?
Hello.
Hello.
Mine is it's not a question, it's just to share our experience. I work as a senior occupational therapist with IIRMS in north of England. I'm based in North Cumbria, and our procedure when somebody is recalled, it's very similar what you described. Good. We tend to follow with the letter appointments, and when we started doing that, we found out how important is it for the guys, and we have received some amazing letter just identify that reaching out and validating and being there in this difficult time with them, it improve our therapeutic relationship, but also sometimes it's give them that additional hope
Yeah.
So it is been very useful with our service.
Amazing. That's really good to hear. Because I think that is pretty, there's not much research into recall, but I think that sense of connection, making connections quickly post recall, that, if there's one, that's probably the single most important thing we can do, isn't it? So it's really good to hear that that's effective for you too. That's not just us.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions? Oh, I'll go back to the chat. Hang on, there's something in the chat. Hang on. Oh, learning difficulties and challenges.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any more questions or observations or comments?
No.
Did you want to say anything else?
No, lovely. Well, thanks ever so much.
Do you just want to go on to the book?
Oh, yes, we will. So just a little bit of self-promotion before we finish. Jo and I have just recently had this book published. It's an edited book. We've written some chapters in it which are pertinent to this presentation, and we've also had an amazing collection of other people who have written chapters. And
there was a chapter specifically about recall, so if that's something you're particularly interested in, co-written with some of the people we've been talking about today, if you're particularly interested in recall, that's a good one.
Yeah,
and I've put some further reading as well on the last slide. You can go back. So you can go back to that one. Just in case anybody's interested, that's quite a lot of those things are available online. The Prison Reform Trust, No Life, No Freedom, No Future, you can just get on the Prison Reform Trust website, and the Fitzhugh Howard, Travers, Wakeley, Webster and Mann paper is available through that link. So yes, if you're interested in recall, there's some things to read there.
But if you're interested, these are our contact details. If you want those references sent to you, just do email Jo or myself.
We've just got another question. Amy has asked, do you deliver this briefing as part of the PSO PQIP training and or to established probation practitioners nationwide? If not, would you consider it? I think it'd be very beneficial for probation practitioners. Thank you very much. I would absolutely consider it.
Yeah, we haven't done.
And we talk a lot about recall in our service, so I guess the people we work with closely probably know our views about recall. And we talk about it a lot, but we're absolutely open to broadening out those ideas. So yeah, thank you for that. I really appreciate it. Sorry, go on, sorry, you're finishing.
That's okay. Please, if you've got any queries, any questions, if you want further information, if you're interested in any of the references, these are Jo and my contact details. Do get in touch and we'll happily help where we can. But thank you very much for coming today. It's been
great.
Thank
you very much. Thank you.